Catherine de' Medici. Catherine de' Medici was only 14 when she married Henry, the son of King Francis. And although she was young, the king and other older men insisted on being present for the consummation of the marriage. Within a month of her birth, illness killed both of Catherine's parents. For the rest of her childhood, the vulnerable Medici heiress would be shuffled between relatives and convents to protect her from the family's enemies in an increasingly volatile Italy. Catherine's fortunes shifted when her uncle Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII. Clement brought his young niece to live in an extravagant palace in Florence, where the people took to fondly calling her the Little Duchess. Medici power in Florence came crashing down in 1527. Cardinal Silvio Passerini overthrew Pope Clement, and suddenly Catherine's peaceful childhood was thrown into chaos once again. Passerini's forces took Catherine hostage and sent her off to live alone in a series of convents. The Pope was desperate to regain his power, and he was willing to make a deal with the devil for it. He begged Charles, the King of Spain, for help. In return, he promised to crown Charles the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1530, anti-Medici armies flanked the nunnery where young Catherine took refuge. The public debated whether the 11-year-old heiress should simply be killed or sent to a house of ill repute to devalue her in the Pope's marriage plans. Thankfully, Florence surrendered that same year before any real harm could come to Catherine. Catherine had gotten her safely out of Florence, and now it was time to find his young orphan niece a husband. Contemporaries loved to highlight that Catherine de' Medici was no great beauty. Even in her youth, a Venetian envoy described her as small of stature and thin and without delicate features, but having the protruding eyes peculiar to the Medici family. Pope Clement hit the jackpot when the King of France, Francis I, offered up his second son for marriage to young Catherine. Francis didn't realize at the time, but he had just invited a viper to the French court, and the country would never be the same. The wedding of Catherine de' Medici and Henry, Duke of Orleans, was a ludicrously extravagant affair. The French and Italians exchanged expensive gifts, ate exotic foods, and partied late into the night. Despite their magical wedding, Catherine de' Medici and Henry didn't see much of each other in their first year of marriage. The Duke spent his time traveling the countryside, while Catherine stayed in the wolf's den among the ladies of the court. But Catherine was a Medici. She was born to play the Game of Thrones. She impressed the court with her wit and tact, and quickly settled into the pace of affairs. In 1534, Catherine's beloved uncle Pope Clement VII passed away, and in an instant Catherine's link to Rome disappeared, and she was suddenly a lot less important. Then Clement's successor, Pope Paul III, made things even worse by refusing to pay the enormous dowry that Clement had promised. In a matter of days, Catherine's standing at the French court had completely changed. Her husband was never meant to become King of France, but things could change extremely quickly in a Renaissance court. In 1536, the heir to the throne, Henry's older brother Francis, was playing a game of tennis when he started feeling ill. In days, he was dead, shocking Europe and thrusting Henry into the line of succession. All of a sudden, the young orphaned Medici girl found herself in line to become the Queen of France, and dark rumors soon began to swirl. Many found it hard to believe that Francis, a young man in the prime of his life, could fall ill and die so suddenly. A single word began to circulate throughout the corners of the French aristocracy: poison. And who would have more motive than the upstart Machiavellian Medici in their midst? Though Catherine was never found to have orchestrated Francis' death, one of her entourage was not so lucky. Sebastiano de Montecuccoli, who arrived in France with Catherine, confessed to poisoning the prince under duress. His admission was enough for King Francis, who had him drawn and quartered. After 10 years of childless marriage, in which people started to question Catherine's fertility, the couple went on to have a whopping 10 kids between 1544 and 1556. 7 of them survived infancy. During this period in 1547, Francis Thorn died and Henry became king. For years, Catherine's greatest rival was Diane de Poitiers, her husband's most beloved mistress. Henry made no effort to hide the fact that he preferred de Poitiers to his wife. This must have been infuriating for Catherine, but then Henry took it even further. He gave de Poitiers the luxurious Château de Chenonceau. Not only was he giving his mistress an entire castle, but Catherine had explicitly told him that she had wanted that particular castle for herself. In 1559, King Henry signed a peace deal with the Holy Roman Empire and England, putting an end to the Italian wars that had been raging for years. To seal the treaty once and for all, Henry betrothed his daughter Elizabeth to Philip II of Spain. An elaborate wedding was planned to celebrate the newfound peace. Little did anyone realize that wedding would end in tragedy. King Henry was quite the jouster, so of course he felt the need to show off his talents at his daughter's wedding. In a clash with a young nobleman, disaster struck. Henry took a lance to the face, shattering the massive wooden weapon and covering his face in splinters. Using blood and with shards of wood sticking out of his face, the king was a gruesome sight. Catherine, Diane de Poitiers, and Catherine's eldest son Francis all fainted upon seeing him. Henry was rushed to a surgeon, but his injuries were even worse than they appeared. Surgeons removed 5 massive splinters from Henry's head, but the damage was done. He had pierced his eye and brain, 2 things you're famously not supposed to pierce with massive splinters. He eventually lost his sight and the ability to speak, and on July 10, 1559, he died at the age of 40. Catherine was devastated. Her eldest son, Francis II, came to the throne at just 15 years old. Although he was technically an adult, he was hardly equipped to rule on his own. And since Catherine was still grieving, a power void developed, one that 2 devious brothers from the House of Guise were quick to fill. In what essentially amounted to a coup d'état, the brothers Guise moved into the Louvre and took their place as advisors to the young king. Francis was the king in name, but everyone knew the dark truth. The Guise brothers were in control. But for how long? Once Catherine had recovered from the shock of her husband's death, she found the Guises in near-complete control of her son's kingdom. At this point, she had no choice but to work with the usurpers, since she didn't have any real power. Yet, Catherine's son Francis was never a robust child, and evidently the pressures of being king only made things worse. Less than a year after he was crowned, he contracted a painful infection and found himself on death's door. Catherine was heartbroken, but she knew she had to act fast to ensure her next son could claim his throne. By the time Francis died, Catherine had done enough political maneuvering to have the royal council name her governor of France. For the first time, she had real political power. According to rumors, Catherine had a stable of about 80 beautiful ladies, whom she would deploy to the beds of various courtiers for espionage and information networking. On top of that, she employed many magicians and sorcerers as well. One of the most famous was Cosimo Ruggieri. Everyone in Paris knew of him, the Queen's trusted necromancer and specialist in the dark arts. Charles IX was technically the king, but Catherine was the real power. Her rule was marked by brutal religious violence. Catholics wanted Protestants persecuted, while Protestants wanted the freedom to practice their religion. The tensions had been bubbling for the better part of a century, but when Catherine came to power, they finally exploded. Even once Catherine became governor of France, the Duke of Guise still held considerable sway in the French court. Catherine mostly put up with him, but she would pay the price for her patience. In 1562, Guise and his men committed the brutal massacre of Vassy. They attacked a group of Protestants known as Huguenots, while they had been worshipping in church. When the violence finally settled down, 74 Huguenots lay dead, and another 104 wounded. Guise had no idea what he had just begun. The massacre of Vassy sparked the French Wars of Religion, the defining conflict of Catherine de' Medici's lifetime. Duke and Huguenot armies would tear the French countryside apart for nearly 30 years, and Catherine, her children, and the rest of the French royal family were in the middle of it. Catherine de' Medici took a remarkably hands-on approach to the French Wars of Religion. She could often be found visiting the field herself to manage affairs. When one of her generals told her that the battlefield was no place for a woman, she laughed and coldly replied, "My courage is as great as yours." The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is the darkest stain on Catherine de' Medici's already disturbing record. As fears of Huguenot reprisals grew, King Charles finally made a grim order: kill them all. Catholics took to the streets with a vicious glee, and things quickly spiraled out of control. The killing started in Paris, but quickly spread to the countryside. No Huguenot was safe. Estimates on the total number of Protestants killed ranged from 5,000 to upwards of 30,000. The massacre completely crippled the source of Huguenot power and marked a crucial turning point in the French Wars of Religion. Towards the end of his life, Charles IX became emotionally unstable. He would fluctuate from boasting about the body count of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre to being guilt-consumed by the atrocities, to simply blaming his mother for being the cause of it all. Ever the practical parent, Catherine declared she had a lunatic for a son. There was never a dull moment in 16th-century French society. Just a couple years after the massacre, Catherine faced a new tragedy and a new crisis. Following in the footsteps of his brother, Charles IX died of illness at just 23 years old. Catherine was forced to bury yet another one of her children, but Charles would not be the last. Next up for the throne was Catherine de' Medici's favorite son, Henry, Duke of Anjou. Catherine's youngest son, Francis, was always the black sheep of the family, known mysteriously as Monsieur. Francis was initially far down in the line of succession. No one ever expected him to amount to much, but suddenly, with Charles dead and Henry lacking children, Monsieur suddenly found himself next up to sit on the throne. But rather than come home and do his duty, Francis betrayed his mother and laid waste to everything she had accomplished. In 1576, Francis did the unthinkable. He allied with the Protestants against his brother and mother. The unlikely alliance forced Catherine to sign the humiliating Edict of Bouillé, giving in to Huguenot demands for the first time in years. Unsurprisingly, she was utterly furious with her rebellious son. But despite his treachery, she was still utterly devastated when fate came to claim him as well. Francis was the next of Catherine de' Medici's children to die young, and his death put her entire legacy at risk. Francis was the last of her sons, and since King Henry had no children, now Henry III of Navarre, her daughter's husband, sat next in line. Everything that Catherine had built was quickly falling apart around her. Now that Henry of Navarre was heir to the French throne, her daughter Margaret, Henry's wife, was more important than ever. But Margaret was even more rebellious than Monsieur had been. Margaret's constant affairs had been a problem before she married Henry III of Navarre, and, let's just say, marriage did little to settle her down. When Margaret returned to the French court in 1582, her mother furiously confronted her about her dalliances. Catherine de' Medici's fury was always something to behold, and her screams could apparently be heard echoing throughout the palace. Catherine sent Margaret back to Navarre to be with her husband, the future King of France. But apparently, Catherine's yelling hadn't straightened out the rebellious Margaret. Soon after, she left Navarre yet again, fleeing to an estate in the French countryside. Then she had the audacity to write to Catherine and beg for money. Disgusted, Catherine sent her daughter only enough money to eat, yet somehow Margaret wasn't done making a mess of things. She took yet another lover, a man named D'Aubiac. This was the final straw. Catherine was done with her daughter's antics. After finding out about Dobiac, Catherine had her daughter locked up in a castle and cut out of her will completely. She never saw Margaret again. As far as Catherine was concerned, her child was dead to her. Catherine's plans for what to do with Dobiac were too cruel even for her son, King Henry. Henry had Dobiac executed, but not as Catherine had wanted in front of Margaret. Henry III valued his mother's advice, that is, until her final days. Catherine had contracted a lung infection and was left bedridden. While she was fighting for her life, she had no idea that her son was plotting to cut her off from power for good. In 1588, Henry fired every single one of his advisors, with no warning. Many of them had been in Catherine's pocket, and this stunning move left Catherine with next to no influence in court. After dismissing all of his mother's cronies, the Duke of Guise was one of the last people between Henry and absolute power. Catherine had already warned him that getting rid of Guise would be a disaster, but Henry wanted blood. In December 1588, Henry invited Guise to visit him in his chambers. On his arrival, he found the king's personal bodyguard waiting for him. They set upon him with their swords, and at that very instant, the rest of the Guise family were being rounded up and killed as well. For the first time in his life, Henry had completely disregarded his mother and acted on his own accord, and he would pay a price for it. The murder of the Duke of Guise, done expressly against Catherine's wishes, took place directly above the bedchamber where she lay dying. After the deed was done, King Henry ventured downstairs and broke the news to his mother himself. "Please forgive me. Monsieur de Guise is dead. He will not be spoken of again. I have had him killed. I have done to him what he was going to do to me." Catherine died mere days later, and some believed that the shock of her son's actions were the tipping point. After laying waste to the Guise family, Henry rounded up several other people whom he considered political enemies. A mere 8 months after Catherine's death, karma came knocking at Henry III's door. The purge of his political enemies did little to settle the chaos in the French court, and he was eventually stabbed to death by a Catholic fanatic. After the death of Catherine and her final son, Henry III, Catherine's son-in-law seized the throne as Henry IV of France. However, he promptly annulled his marriage to Catherine's daughter Margaret and replaced her with Catherine's own cousin, Marie de Medici. Catherine de Medici played the Game of Thrones and played it well for decades, but like many French nobles, she ended up in an extremely ignoble resting place. Catherine's bones, along with those of many other French kings and queens, were dug up during the French Revolution and unceremoniously tossed into a mass grave. Catherine de Medici got a disturbing introduction to the world of French politics on her wedding night. She and Henry were the same age, both 14 years old, but old men still wormed their way into the honeymoon. Henry's father, King Francis III, apparently stayed in the bedroom until the marriage was fully consummated. Catherine's uncle, Pope Clement, had a little bit more class at least. He visited the couple in bed the next morning to confirm the previous night's proceedings. Gross.